Welcome to Car Gurus, where today we're talking about the 10 best RS Audis of all time. Now, these are my 10 best RS Audis of all time. If you disagree, make sure you let me know in the comments. Now, Audi, as we know, more or less invented the four-wheel drive performance car with the original Quattro in 1980. It wasn't the first four-wheel drive performance car, but it took that technology mainstream. And since then, Audi has built its brand on four-wheel drive technology. Even now, that's what Audi is known for, fast four-wheel drive cars. Therefore, most of the cars on this list are four-wheel drive, but there's one that powers only one axle rather than both of them. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. Remember, if you're in the market for a used RS Audi or any used car for that matter, head to cargurus.co.uk where you'll find tons of high quality used cars from top rated dealers. Go and check it out. Let's get cracking with my list of the 10 best RS Audis of all time. In no particular order, the first on the list is the very first RS Audi, the RS2 Avant. As well as being the first RS Audi, the RS2 was one of the original performance estate cars. So for those two reasons alone, it's already an icon. It was developed in partnership with Porsche, as we all know, hence the Porsche script on the brake caliper and those tiny little door mirrors that were borrowed from a 911. Its engine is a 2.2 litre 5-cylinder turbo. It produced 315 horsepower, which was plenty back in the mid-90s. The car arrived in 1994, and with four-wheel drive, it was one of the most accelerative cars on the road, and clearly the fastest car, also able to transport a wardrobe. Even now, the RS2 feels really quick. There's a lot of turbo lag to work around, but once you're through that, it pulls really hard. When you start flinging the car around as hard as you dare, you realize that actually it's quite short on body control compared to modern stuff. It can get a little bit hairy. So instead, you stroke the car along, enjoying that 5-cylinder warbling soundtrack, enjoying that oily slick gear change, and of course, that bright blue interior trim. Next up is the original Audi R8, the V8 one. Now, hands up, you won't find an RS logo anywhere on the Audi R8 because Audi never actually badged it as an RS, but it was designed and engineered and built by the same people responsible for all RS Audis, now called Audi Sport, formerly Quattro. So, I mean, you couldn't leave it off the list, could you? Particularly because the R8 V8 is the best performance car Audi has ever built. I'm putting it out there. It's a bold claim, but I stand by it, and I can back it up as well because that thing is gorgeous to drive. It's at its best with a manual gearbox. I actually prefer the V8 engine to the more powerful V10, and it's just gorgeous to drive. It steers wonderfully. It's got a lovely, supple, fluid ride, really good chassis balance as well. Just makes the R8 such an interactive car to drive. Those are all things that we assumed Audi actually wasn't capable of engineering into its cars. And given that it hasn't managed to do so since, perhaps it was just a fluke. Third on the list is the RS4, the B7 one specifically. Now, if you love driving, this is the RS4 for you. Later RS4s, they're faster, they're more sophisticated. But if you really enjoy the finer points of driving, this is the highlight, the best one of the whole lot. Now, whether you've got it in saloon guise or estate guise, Audi call that Avant, it looks fantastic, sort of subtly muscular. Later versions went a bit cartoonish with their proportions and with their detailing. All that subtlety was gone. I happen to much prefer that more restrained approach of the B7 RS4. Now, that car, of course, used the same 4.2 litre V8 as the R8 that I spoke about just now, 414 brake horsepower. It's a high revving unit. It's not a sort of torque-rich sledgehammer, so you really have to get down the gears, chase the red line to get the RS4 clipping along a road, but that's the way you want it, isn't it? Like most high-performance Audis of the time, that B7 RS4 was very nose-heavy, and it had a very sort of nose-led cornering stance. It could be a bit frustrating, but with four-wheel drive, in wet weather, that car had a kind of cross-country pace that BMW M3 drivers could only dream of. Right, moving on. And we've got our first RS6, the current RS6 Avant, all 600 horsepower of it. It's such a great car. For almost 20 years, the RS6 was thunderously powerful. It looked great. It was sure-footed, whatever the weather. But it was never brilliant to drive, at least not until the current one came along, the C8 in 2020. It really was a game changer for the RS6. Technologies like a differential in the rear axle, like rear wheel steering, they just help make the car much more agile, much more responsive to drive rather than just sort of one-dimensional point and squirt machines. But it does look pretty outlandish, doesn't it? As I've said, I prefer my Audi performance cars to look quite restrained, quite subtle. But the C8 RS6 just forgets all of that stuff and just goes full crazy with its proportions, with its detailing. It's a very sort of in-your-face kind of car. At least you'll be able to console yourself with what I think is one of the best interiors on sale today. I mean, that cabin is spectacularly good, high quality, it's spacious, it looks gorgeous, really good seats. What a place that is to spend hour after hour. And that engine, oh my God, 600 horsepower, twin turbo V8, it's a powerhouse. Okay, we're approaching the halfway point in this list and we're dropping from 600 horsepower to a meager 400 horsepower with the RS3, the previous one. There will be a new one soon, but the one I like is the previous one. Now, for a long time, the RS3 was blunt to drive. It was leaden-footed, felt heavy, felt inert. But in 2017, when Audi updated the previous model, it made massive improvements to it. A new crankcase took something like 20 kilograms out of the weight of the engine and therefore out of the nose of the car, so it was just better balanced. And they made revisions to the four-wheel drive system, to the suspension and steering, and all of a sudden the RS3 was much better to drive. That potential that was within it for years got released, and suddenly that car was much more involving to drive. And of course you still had that wonderful, really characterful 5-cylinder turbo engine that was just a proper monster. Around 400 horsepower, loads of torque, and a really distinctive Audi 5-cylinder soundtrack. That RS3 is the best of the lot, but even so, it's never the sharpest car in its class. You think something like a BMW M2, okay, it doesn't have 4 or 5 doors, but it's a similar sort of car and a much more engaging driving experience. But when you look at the whole RS3 ownership package, the way it looks, that high quality cabin, the security of four-wheel drive, that great engine, I mean, that's a hell of an ownership proposition. Right, let's turn things up a bit. Let's start talking about another supercar, the R8 V10, specifically the RWD. Okay, we know Audi built its brand on four-wheel drive technology. That's what it stands for, really. Four-wheel drive is as synonymous with Audi as that 4-ring logo, isn't it? We just see an Audi and think four-wheel drive. But the best of the current R8s, as far as I'm concerned, is the RWD, the rear-wheel drive one. Seems odd to say, doesn't it? But it's a simpler car. It doesn't have front drive shafts, doesn't have adaptive dampers, doesn't have fancy dynamic steering. So it's a much purer, simpler car, and therefore just more rewarding to drive because of it. And of course, it still has that outrageous 5.2 litre V10 engine, which just goes like hell and sounds fantastic. The thing about the four-wheel drive R8s is that they've got bundles of grip and so much traction. They're just hilariously quick along a road, but they're quite remote cars because of it. The RWD is a more involving car. Now the RWD picks up where the RWS left off. That was a limited edition car, limited to 999 examples around the world, divided between coupe and spider body styles. Here's a left field candidate for this list. The surprisingly fun RS Q3. Now I'm talking about the previous one. It's essentially an RS3 on stilts. Now the RS Q3 isn't the sort of car that drivers, enthusiastic drivers, would be drawn to. But because it's a bit taller, because it has a more supple ride and a slightly more playful kind of character and chassis balance, it's actually a little bit more rewarding to drive even than the RS3. And it's got that same 2.5 litre turbo engine, 5 cylinders, so strong, really characterful. but it's more the soundtrack and the engine character than the sheer force of the acceleration that's just so hilarious in that crossover SUV body style. Now, you and I, people who really love cars, will spot an RS Q3 a mile off, those quad exhaust tips, big wheels, body styling, but to most people, it's just another SUV. They would never know that beneath the bonnet, it's got enough power to frighten BMW M car drivers. Okay, yet another car with that 5-cylinder Audi engine. It's the TT RS. The TT RS was one of only a handful of Audi performance cars to combine that 2.5-litre engine with a manual gearbox. You could get a DSG box, but the manual was really the one you wanted. And that powertrain combination in a little coupe body shell, that's just so cool, isn't it? This is the Mark II TT, and it had loads of power, 4-wheel drive, and that gave it a turn of pace along a wet, bumpy, twisting British B road that few cars had. Something like a Porsche Cayman, it wouldn't see which way the TT RS went in those conditions. However, I must admit the TT RS, beneath the skin, is basically a VW Golf, and that means it goes into battle with a bespoke, clean sheet sports car like the Cayman with one arm tied behind its back. Okay, another RS6 Avant, a second appearance on this list for the RS6 Avant, but I couldn't leave off the previous shaped car because I just love it so much. Even now, I think it's one of the most handsome performance estate cars there's ever been. I think in time we'll look back on it and think that was the high point for Audi design, just subtler, but menacing in an under-the-radar way. I just think it looks fantastic, muscle without being silly and cartoonish. The C7 is not as engaging to drive as the current RS6, but it's still a compelling super estate car in its own way. I mean, it's got loads of power again, a twin-turbo V8. It's got 4-wheel drive traction and stability, a great cabin. It's brilliant over long distances. What else can you realistically expect of a super estate car than all of that? The performance one, that's the one that you want. It appeared towards the end of its life with 600 horsepower. It would do 0 to 62 in 3.7 seconds, making it faster off the line than some mid-engine supercars. Right, it's time for the last car on the list, and it's a bit of a wild card. Admittedly, I haven't driven the new RS eTron GT. A bold move maybe including it on this list, but maybe not, because it's very closely related to the brilliant Porsche Taycan, which I have driven plenty. That car is fantastic. So maybe it's not such a bold move after all. The RS eTron GT is all electric, uses 2 electric motors. Between them, they produce 637 brake horsepower, plenty in other words. This is Audi's first RS badged EV. 0 to 62 in 3.3 seconds. That's probably fast enough, isn't it? Like the Taycan, it uses an 800-volt electrical architecture, which means its batteries can be charged much more quickly than a conventional EV. Even so, the real-world electric range will be something like 250 miles, which is going to be pretty limiting for some people. Can it possibly be as good to drive as the Porsche Taycan? I don't know. We'll see. Audi says it's pitched its version of that car more as a Grand Tourer, more civilized, more luxurious, more comfortable over long distances. So it should have a character all of its own. So there we are, our top 10 RS Audis of all time. Let us know what you think. Stick your lists in the comment below. Tell me which ones I've missed, which ones shouldn't be on the list, and make sure you subscribe to the CarGurus YouTube channel.